Welcome to Gelatin Art Market's Academy of Gelatin Art. Lesson number 3. This is where the fun begins. In this lesson, we are going to talk about how to draw flowers with different types of needles. First of all, let's discuss what kind of needles you can use for gelatin art. The most commonly available needles are needles that are used for the medical industry. These needles are clean and made of food-safe materials. The thickness of the needle can be determined by its gauge value. The higher the number, the thinner the needle. For example, a 25 gauge needle will be a lot thinner than a 16 gauge needle. For drawing most gelatin art flowers, you will use a needle that is 22 to 20 gauge. Another thing to look for is whether the needle is sharp or blunt. For drawing regular petals, you will want a sharp tip needle. Always keep the needle hole facing up when you are drawing. This will minimize the tearing and help you make clean, sharp petals in gelatin. We are ready to start drawing now. If you will be joining us, pause this video and get ready. Okay, let's begin. Fill your syringe with color and attach a sharp tip needle. Check to see if there are any air bubbles in it. If you see some, turn the syringe upward. Let the bubbles come up to the top. Cover the needle with a napkin and push the air out. Hold the syringe in your hand and feel the temperature. If you are using the recipe from our previous lesson, it should not feel warm. If it needs to cool down, wait for a few minutes before continuing. In your practice container, try to make a few shapes. Try to make several small petals at the edge of the container. If you get a lot of excess color on the surface, wipe it with a wet napkin or paper towel. Absorbent napkins work much better than paper towels for this purpose. Take a napkin tablet out of the container and pour some water onto it. Squeeze the water out and wipe the gelatin surface. Now, try to move the needle up and down to make a carnation petal. If your petals are not filled with color evenly, you can reinsert the needle and fill the petal with more color. You may notice that when you use a sharp needle to fill the petal again, it often creates tiny cuts and scratches on the petal surface. Use a blunt needle to fill your petals to reduce the damage done to petals when you are refilling them. If you are having trouble taking the needle of the syringe, try to cover it with a napkin for a better grip. When you are comfortable making small petals, try creating larger ones. Notice how the color base is performing. If you see a lot of color base coming out after you have drawn a shape, your color base might be too warm, or you might not have enough gelatin in it. When the color base cools down and thickens up too much, You will see that it is difficult to work with, and the petals don't look as crisp and even. You can pause this video now and continue practicing. Don't use more than a half of the test container for now. When you are ready, we will try to make our first flower. Let's try to make a flower that resembles a carnation. Before you start, take a second sharp needle and see if you can gently bend it at an angle. Make sure the needle opening is facing up and be very gentle. You want to make sure the liquid can still flow through the needle after it has been bent. Put this needle aside for now. Make sure your color base is liquid and at room temperature. Fill the syringe, attach the straight sharp needle, and push the air out. Start drawing the flower center by pulling the needle up and down while gently applying pressure. It doesn't really matter how this first petal looks. It's hard to control such a small shape when you are moving the needle. Wipe the gelatin surface with a napkin and try to make 3 small petals around the center. Move the needle up and down again while applying pressure. As you are adding petals, try to work from the container center. Do not put your needle straight down into gelatin. Try to keep the needle at an angle so that the petals all start from the same point in the center. Add more petals around the center and make the petals just a little bit longer with each row. Try to keep the distance between petal rows small, or you will run out of space quickly. Once you create several rows, you will notice that the straight needle can't reach the upper part of the gelatin dessert. Attach the bent needle at this point and finish the last few rows of petals. The very last row of the carnation can be the same length as the previous row. This will give the flower a nice round look. Remember to leave space for the leaves. Congratulations! You've made your first flower. Take a moment to enjoy it and post a picture of it on Facebook. When you come back, we'll try to draw a rose. Now that you've made a carnation, you will see that there is a bit of excess color gathering on the flower surface that needs to be cleaned up occasionally. To avoid having to wipe the gelatin surface all the time, you can make a small hole in the middle of your dessert. You can make this hole with a small teaspoon or measuring spoon or a melon baller. Or a round gelatin melting tool. To melt a nice round hole, place the tool into boiling water for a while and then melt the hole in the center of the dessert. You can collect the excess gelatin from the top using an absorbent napkin. Or you can turn the dessert upside down and let the melted gelatin drip down. Be very careful when you are doing this. Both the melting tool and the melted gelatin will be very hot. Okay, now that you have the gelatin ready, let's make a rose center. Check to see whether your color is at the right temperature. Warm it up or cool it down as needed. When you are only using needles to make a rose, the easiest way to start is to create 2 tiny petals facing each other in the middle of the dessert. In the next lesson, we will talk about making a rose center with tools. Once you create these first 2 petals, draw 3 more around them. Instead of drawing the petals one beside the other, get your petals to overlap. Continue to add overlapping petals, increasing the size and number of petals with each row. Sometimes it is easier to move the container than to draw the whole petal just by moving the needle. Remember to keep a small distance between the rows. You don't want to run out of space too soon. If you notice small holes or air bubbles in your petals, fill them with color using a blunt needle. As the center hole gets filled with color, empty it with a small measuring spoon. Turn your dessert over from time to time. If your flower is not round, use the next row of petals to correct it. When the straight needle can't go any higher, attach the bent needle and make the last row of petals. If you are working in a small container, don't put too many rows of petals. A small flower will look beautiful when leaves are added. Fill the center hole with color and allow it to harden in the fridge before adding leaves. The strong green color that is usually used for rose leaves doesn't look very good when it's mixed with other colors. It's always better to have the rose color thicken up completely and not absorb any of the green color. When you are ready, fill the syringe with the green color and attach the bent needle to it. Push the needle straight in and create tiny spikes alongside the leaf edge on both sides. This is tricky. Don't get frustrated if the leaves are not perfect the first time you try them. Pay attention where your needle is. It should neither be too close to the rose petals nor to the gelatin surface. The needle hub should also not get too far away from the center. If it does, there will be a gap between the leaf and the rose. If this does happen, a quick way to fix it is to smear a little bit of color on the gap surface. This will give the illusion that the leaf is continuous when the dessert is turned upside down. And there you go. You have made a rose in gelatin. Don't worry if it wasn't perfect. It will take some practice and experimentation to find what works for you. You can take a small break now. Rinse the needles and the syringes. When you come back, we'll try another flower. Welcome back. In this section, we'll talk about how to make a flower with a fuzzy center. This technique can be used for gerberas, zinnias, daisies, and many other flowers found in nature. We start by making a hole in the gelatin center again. Check to see if your color is at room temperature and liquid. The flower center is made by inserting the sharp needle tip repeatedly into gelatin. Apply only a little bit of pressure to release very small amounts of color. Here, it is very important that the color is at room temperature or a bit colder. If the color is warm, it will not remain in the gelatin and the flower center will look faint. Remove the excess color occasionally and check to see what the flower center looks like. The spike should be more or less the same length and the center itself should be round. You can place tiny spikes or several larger ones, depending on what kind of flower you are making. You can even combine the two. When you are happy with the shape of the center, clean the hole with a napkin and deliberately inject a little bit of color above the center. This will help keep the center color the same, regardless of what color is used for the petals later. Cover only the surface of the center. Do not fill the whole center hole. Leave the dessert in the fridge for a few minutes to thicken up. When the center is set, fill your syringe with the next color and attach a straight, sharp needle. Create a tiny crown around the center using either the same color you will use for your petals or another contrasting color. When you are done, clean up the excess color from the hole, but be careful not to remove the center color from the bottom. Next, we are going to add petals. The first row of petals will be a blueprint for all other rows, so slow down and place these petals carefully. Make the first petal anywhere you like. It should be a short one and placed at a sharp angle. Remember how deep the needle was inserted so that you can make the rest of the petals the same length. The petals in these flowers can be round or sharp. Place the next petal on the opposite side of the center. This will ensure that the space between petals is more or less the same. The third and fourth petals should be placed between the first two, opposite one another. After that, make 4 more petals in between the initial 4. At this point, you can continue to place petals in the remaining gaps. When you are ready to move on to the next row, place the petals a little bit higher and in between the petals in the first row. These petals should be longer, but make sure that they do not go all the way to the container wall. Every new row of petals should be longer and placed exactly between the petals in the previous row. Switch to a bent needle when the straight needle can't reach high enough. To make a sharp petal, push the needle in straight and then move the needle tip to the side as you pull it out. You can practice this movement in your practice container until you get the hang of it. The petals don't have to be all the same shape. Here is one example of a flower that has random petal shapes. There is one more thing we want to cover before we wrap up this lesson. When you use the blunt needle to inject color into gelatin directly, you get a line with a flat circle at the top. These tiny dots resemble thick clusters of baby's breath flowers and are often used to complete other flowers and fill gaps in gelatin art desserts. To make really tiny dots, it is best to use a very thin needle and the smallest syringe you can find. When the color base starts to come out of the needle, stop applying pressure. The dot will continue to grow for another second or two. It is also important to have the color at the right temperature. To make tiny little dots, wait until the color base is almost starting to thicken up. If you wish to make larger spots or wish to mix different colors together, use warmer temperatures and larger needles. To make elongated shapes, use sharp needles. You can also make petals and leaves using this technique. Use larger needles and inject the color while pulling the needle out. The petals created this way are quite unpredictable, but no two petals are exactly the same in nature either. To take the dessert out of the container, lower it into warm tap water for a few seconds. If you are using thicker plastic or glass containers, it might take a few minutes for the dessert to detach from the container. Drain the excess gelatin and turn the container upside down onto a plate. That's it for this lesson. We hope you had fun making your first gelatin art flowers. Join us for our next lesson, where we will discuss different types of gelatin art tools and how to use them.